Textual healing. Textual healing.
What's up, textual healers? Hope you've been having safe text. It's Molly here with co-hosts Riley and Cooper. Cooper, what do we have on the menu for today?
On our menu today, we'll be looking at Introduction to Myth by Peter Stillman. A very interesting mythological textbook here from Heinemann Publishers.
I personally like the book, Riley. How do you feel?
Well, I feel alright about it. Something that you've said quite often, that it's more of an anthology of myth rather than a study of myth, has really stuck out to me. Because I was going into this thinking, oh my gosh, we're going to learn how to, study myth, how we can apply this in our classrooms. No, that's really not what happened, and it was a little disappointing. But, there are some good ideas to be found in this text, but, it wasn't what I was expecting, so...
I will agree with you there. I do think that this truly is an anthology with some brief explanations scattered. However, the introduction offered really good insight for me on how to actually study myths.
I will have to agree with you there. The introduction, I feel like, was the best part of the book.
I would agree. The introduction offers us a great explanation of what myth actually is, and kind of disproves the theory that myth is just an explanation of things that don't really exist. The book offers a quote about mythology and storytelling, saying, "Storytelling raises a person out of the randomness of the moment and inserts them into a larger framework." And I do think that the book does a good job explaining how we can understand that and be able to relate that to students.
For sure. What do you think, Cooper?
I'm so glad you asked. I don't like this book. This book was misleading, and it led me on, and it disappointed me in a few seconds. I'm going to read you a quote from the Heinemann website on how they advertised the book. The very first sentence in their description is, "This is not a collection of myths, but a study of mythology itself." The introduction talks about myth as a whole, and that's the first 20 pages of the book, and the rest of the book is a collection of myths. It's dumb. This is not a book that I can use in the classroom for students. I could use it as a teacher.
For sure.
But there's no way I could just give this to my students and have it be a useful text.
You see, I'll agree and disagree with you there. I do think that if you're doing a whole class on mythologies, this would be a good textbook to have to just say, read at the beginning of class 2 to 5 pages real quick right here. I don't think that this is the type of book where you can incorporate it into any English classroom. I don't think that there's necessarily enough types of reading to cover maybe even a month-long unit.
Mm-hmm.
But it does have some interesting stories and some interesting perspectives.
So I agree with you, but as future high school teachers, all of us, none of us are going to have the opportunity, at least for the first 5 or 10 years, to just teach a class on myth. And that's the only context in which this would be useful.
Had to bring reality into it.
Yeah, that's what I do.
I thought it was really interesting what the book had to offer about the integration of myth into all literature, especially the canon. What do you think, Riley?
I think that was very interesting. An analogy that I kept thinking of was how all squares are rectangles, but not all rectangles are squares. And that kind of fits into how all literature is myth, but not all myth is literature. And so that was kind of like a moment for me. I'm like, oh wow, that is very interesting and just opens up a new way of thinking that I would think that I would like to incorporate in the classroom and discuss with my students on their views of literature and whatnot.
Say some more about that. How is not all myth literature? Because isn't all myth written down?
Not necessarily, because myths started out as stories, and from generation to generation to generation, it's passed down, never written down. Eventually, today we do have myths that are written down and more accessible that way, but they didn't start out that way. And so literature, typically, if we're thinking of books, they are written. They are not storytelling through the spoken word, not the written word.
Although I doubt any of us here heard all of these myths from somebody telling them to
Very
us.
true.
I think we read or watched or heard about them in song from all of these. So would that not mean that all myths are literature now?
That raises an interesting point, and the book does focus on religion as myth quite a bit. And while this might seem controversial, let's remind ourselves that myth is less of a explanation for something mystic and more of an origin story in a lot of cases. So when we're talking about an actual etiology or origin story when it comes to the Bible, the book even uses the fall of man as a great example of myth in culture, religion, in spoken word. In looking at the Torah of the Bible, I mean, all of those books were used by spoken word for centuries and centuries before they were ever written down. And while they were eventually written down, and we could constitute that as like the written literature we have today, we have to think, does the spoken word element of that not constitute like storytelling being a valuable part of myth, considering how much has actually derived from those reiterations? Specifically in the canon, though. When we're talking about myth in the canon, there's so many books in the canon, and none of them seem to be mythological.
The only thing I can think there is like the Odyssey and the Iliad, but that, I don't know, doesn't necessarily fit inside the Western canon. But I do, like, to me, I consider that more of like your classics. So like, I don't know.
I think you can find bits of myth within every piece of our canon. For example, I was in this poetry class the other day, and we were talking about this poem that I can't remember the name of, by this poet that I can't remember the name of, but it's a very influential poem, and we looked at it for about 10 minutes and realized, oh, this is just another way of talking about the story of Persephone and Hades from Greek mythology. So I think if we genuinely look hard enough, we can find bits of mythology in every piece of canonical literature we have today.
I would agree with you, but not just in that sense as much as the sense of the study of mythology. Like, what constitutes a myth? And here we have some themes outlined by this book. Fright, humor, arousal, compassion, and sadness. When you think about those themes, I think almost every book is able to touch on at least some of those. Not only that, but when we're thinking about the different types of myths and the difference between the widely accepted myth like Jack and the Beanstalk versus a monomyth, where it is something that's less about a hero and more about a destruction or just an explanation for a being, it makes more sense to be able to sort of fit all types of books and all pieces of literature into one of those categories. And I think it honestly might be hard to find a book that I wouldn't constitute as mythological in some sense.
A well-written one, at least.
Definitely.
I've definitely read books that don't hit any of those, but those books aren't well known for a good reason.
It is important to touch on the universal nature of myth. It seems like myth is shared amongst all human beings, and when we think about myth, we think of dragons and Greek gods and things that aren't necessarily a part of our everyday world. So why do they affect every person?
Because in some form or another, there's a moral, there's a lesson in there. And I feel like that's why the history of mythology goes so far back, is because in one way or another, it's teaching future generations, consequences of your actions, good and bad, right and wrong, good and evil, etc., etc.
That's a great point, Riley. And to add on to that, I'd like to point out, maybe this is controversial, but I'd like to point out the fact that myth never left. It's just changed forms. Specifically looking at comic book culture. Pretty much every popular comic book, Spider-Man, Batman, Superman, not really Superman, but sometimes, you can totally find the hero's journey in any of those. There's other... Spider-Man in particular has some really dark, depressing, tragic storylines, we can definitely find semblances of myth. That's kind of the reincarnation of myth in our modern world, is through comic books.
For sure, and off of that as well, you've got like urban legends and tall tales like campfire stories and stuff like that I feel you can definitely constitute as a modern form of mythology.
So would you say we're making new myths, Riley?
To an extent, I feel like maybe not necessarily myths yet, but like, I don't know, legends.
Like Mothman.
Exactly like Mothman.
I want to go back for a second to something you said about good versus evil. You were listing some attributes of just ordinary literature, and I want to talk about that duality and the dualities that we often see in mythologies, because there's actually quite a few of them. And while I'm not going to directly list them, it is important to note how many books in the actual Western canon that focus on these dualities, such as Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, The Wolfman, The Picture of Dorian Gray, and Dracula. Are those not great examples of myth that we can teach in the classroom?
Absolutely.
On the other hand, how strictly do we want to stay in the canon?
And that is a widely debated topic, I feel like, especially in our field, that it's very complex and controversial.
I'd agree. I would say there's a mix. Everyone sits somewhere. For me personally, I would say I'm probably 40% in the canon, 60% outside. And that's not including like short stories and things like that, but I do think that many of the smaller pieces I like would be typically taught in an English classroom.
Mm-hmm.
But I would like to think that all of the books in the canon, I'd like to relate back to this someday in a classroom. I'd hope students can understand how all books are connected to the original sources of origin stories and mythologies. And I think it's inspiring for kids to understand how, by joining in communication through literature, they're reaching back thousands, not thousands. We're cutting that. Without thousands? Yeah, thousands of
mythology.
years. Yeah. I mean,
tens of
I guess.
thousands, probably.
Because I'm pretty sure cavemen had their own myths.
Okay, so as a teacher, I don't know if I'd recommend other teachers buy this book for their classroom or for them to teach in their classroom. However, for me, I'm glad I read it, and I think I will incorporate it some way, somehow, someday.
That's a very good point of would I recommend teachers buying this? Is it worth the money? Not necessarily, but again, I am glad that I've read it and we have the chance to discuss this, because I'm for sure that you can find a bunch of other different resources on how to actually study mythology and how to teach it. I mean, it's valuable to us in this instance because we're able to pluck out the things that we do find important and then discuss, maybe why not. But, I mean, going forward as a teacher, and since I have read it, I will incorporate that knowledge. But I don't think it's necessary per se for everyone to read it.
But do you think myth belongs in the English classroom?
Always. 100%.
Perfect.
Continuing off what you said, Riley, I also probably wouldn't recommend this book. I've expressed my disappointment with it. But just to expand on your point, we were expecting this book to tell us, or at least provide examples on how to teach myth in a classroom. And it doesn't. It offers some insight to myth,
and like
for
some
sure.
analysis of myth.
Yeah, and it is helpful in the fact that it kind of categorizes a bunch of myths together and kind of tracks the evolution of those myths through time. It's a very interesting resource in that regard, but you could probably find that online.
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing in this book that makes you need to read it as a teacher.
To go off what you're saying there, I'd agree. I would say that I understand myths enough now to be able to teach someone something else, but this is not a book about teaching myth.
Mm-hmm. It's more of a book of how to analyze it and, deeper thinking of myth.
I would say it's even a book of like an ode to myth.
Yeah.
It's an appreciation of myth.
Yes. That would have been a better title. An appreciation of myth.
I'd dumb it down more, and I'd say it's just connecting the dots. That's all it really does, is it gives us a litany of examples of different myths, and it says, this is the common thread between those myths. And then it moves on.
I do have to give the book some credit for telling me I'm wrong. Because I am that person who uses myth as like a unicorn or something that never actually happened. I use it as synonymous with something that's not real. And now that I understand that that's not what myth is, I don't think I'm going to do that anymore.
Yeah.
Since starting this book, I haven't done that. And I have been thinking about myth a lot. And while it might just be a lack of understanding on my part previously, it did teach me something. And I have to give it a little bit of credit for that.
And I feel like that goes to popular culture, how we misinterpret, you know, myths, literature, words. So
That's a great discussion on the connotation of words versus
Yes.
denotation. What is a word supposed to mean versus what do we make this word mean in our current day and age?
I mean, if you were to ask me a couple weeks ago what myth meant,
something that's not real.
something that's not real. But the first thing that this book says in the introduction is myth is not an intellectual reaction to a puzzle, but an explicit act of faith. That's what it comes down to, I think. Human nature.